All right, so one way to check out how people feel about Congress as a whole is to check out congressional approval, like really like ratings of how um, Americans' approval of the job that Congress is doing. I captured this from a Gallup survey poll, which you can click on the link here in the slides and find the Gallup survey I got this from. But let's see what we're seeing here. This is measured from January 2020 to October of 21. And let's see what we're seeing here. In January 2020, we see a 23% approval rating. It goes up to 31% in April, down to 21 around July. See here October, January 2021, and really interestingly enough, in January 2021, we see a big push in the positive approval rating to 36% approval rating. I wonder what happened in January 2021 to push up the approval rating. Well, if you're not thinking of the insurrection, you might be missing out on something potentially here of how that went up so high of Congress. And then we see down to 26 in, it looks like maybe June, July, and this poll ends in October of 21 at 21%. So we're seeing some things here that I think are notable. What's also notable is that we're also talking about less than 50% approval rating, right? The highest on this period of time tops out at 36% approval rating. Okay, so that gets to our earlier point of Americans liking their congressperson, but not typically liking Congress as a whole. All right, moving on to 4 different kinds of representation. Okay, let's see here. 4 types of representation. Okay, so there's policy. That's congressional work to advance the issues and ideological preferences of constituents. Right? Remember, policy is creation of legislation, right? So trying to advance the issues, create new laws, change laws, right? Trying to work on behalf of one's constituents. Again, that's the people who elected. Those are not just those who elected them, right? Because even if people voted for the other person, the people that are ultimately in that community are still the constituents of the representative. Another thing that they do is allocative, right? Another word for that is pork barrel. That's congressional work to secure projects, services, and funds for the district. I think about that as like bring home the pork or bring home the bacon. A saying that I have heard in my own life. I'm not sure if you've heard it in yours, but this idea of bringing home the bacon is about bringing home money and or resources. So when we think about that as it relates to government, we're thinking about the projects that are being brought home to the community, the services being brought home. Are there new road projects? Are there new development projects, things happening in the community based off of the work that the representative has done to get new or improving projects in the community? Another kind of representation is via casework. Casework is assistance solving constituent problems with government agencies and programs. So something that comes to mind is I went to an event that Dr. Raul Ruiz was holding a few years back at the Palm Springs Convention Center called Veterans University. And yes, just like it's in the name, it was directed at veterans. Part of the casework example was in people calling the representative, right, Representative Ruiz, to highlight that they had not received a medal that they had earned while in the military. Okay, so Dr. Ruiz's office helped to track down those medals, right, and then help secure those for constituents, right, people who were in the community. Beyond that, there was also something symbolic. Is that in Veterans University or at Veterans University, Dr. Ruiz gave out these medals to veterans, right? So it highlighted both of these here, both the casework, so assisting people with government agencies, and that would just be one, right? Thinking about the VA, okay? Or symbolic, right? Efforts to stand for American ideals or identify with common constituency values. And I think it highlighted and it stood with constituency values, right, at an event called Veterans University, where the target audience are veterans, to then place people's medals, to then, gift people's medals and place them on them, highlighted sort of symbolic work and symbolic, the symbolism of that, right? I'm not just getting the medal in the mail, but having a sort of ceremony around the receiving of those medals, right? So these are just some highlights of these 4 kinds of representation. Now it's a good time here to do some compare and contrast here, particularly as we think about representatives who go on to work in the Congress or in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, is to compare and contrast those who are in those positions. So let's see if I can move this here. All right, our comparison. House versus the Senate here, okay? So on the left-hand side here, we've got the House, and on the right-hand side, the Senate. So let's check out the constitutional differences. Well, one difference is in the term length served here. So members of the House of Representatives serve 2-year terms, whereas senators serve 6-year terms. The minimum age is different. While to be in the House, the minimum age is 25 years old, and for the Senate, it's 30. Okay. Citizenship required of both of these, of both the House and the Senate, but the number of years needing to have had citizenship is different. 7 years for the House and 9 years for the Senate. Okay. Now, apportionment has to do with the number of seats per state, really. So there's the number of members of the House of Representatives has stayed the same for over 100 years. So the numbers each state gets really depends on how many people live in that state. And we learn about how many people live in each state through this thing called the census, right? So the census has a lot of important things tied to it, including consequences of how the seats get split up amongst the states, based on this idea of apportionment, highlighting, right, where's the majority, or where are the populations where the population of Americans living across the U.S. of A. Okay, and now that apportionment is fixed in the Senate, meaning that the number of seats in the Senate is fixed, right? And you may already know this, especially as you think about the Great Compromise. Okay, so the number of Senate seats is 2 seats per state, regardless of state size, right? Whether or not they've got huge populations or very small populations, each state has 2 senators. Okay, the size of the House of Representatives is 435 members. As I noted, it's been that way since 1910. Whereas the Senate, there are 100 members, right? There are 50 states with 2 senators per state. That's 100 members. Okay. The number of standing committees differ between the House and the Senate. And something else that stands out here, I think we ought to note here, is the difference of money, the amount of money spent on average by winners of both the House and the Senate, the most expensive campaigns, and the incumbency advantage. I think incumbency is really important to note here. What is incumbency? Or who is the incumbent? Now, the incumbent is the person that's in the job already. And they have the advantage, right? And why would they have the advantage? Well, they're already in the job. People probably know their name and have heard of their name. Whether or not they know about what they've done or not, they have this advantage here. So we see that the incumbency advantage is quite high for members of the House, right? And still quite high for members of the Senate. All right, checks and balances. Checks and balances. Now, we've seen this before on another slide. right? Highlighting the role of checks and balances between the different parts of government, parts of federal government. Remember, each branch of federal government has the ability to what we call check another branch, right? So each branch has jobs that they do, right? The jobs that they do, and if they do their job, even still doing their job, whatever it's set out to be, right? Another branch can still say, hey, let's follow up on that issue, right? So for example, Congress passes bills, okay? But the president signs those bills or vetoes those bills, right? The ability to sign or veto bills is the president's ability to have a check on Congress, right? Either way, signing it, it's a review, yeah, I approve, or vetoing it, okay, I don't approve, I'm not going to go further with this, right? That is the check of the presidency on the Congress, okay? So the president executes laws and administers the executive branch, whereas Congress exercises oversight of executive branch activities, right? So what does that mean? That means the president executes laws, right, and administers the executive branch, and can do things like, what's an example? Oh, this is a great example, right? The president can select, right, when there's an open seat, can select a member for the Supreme Court. But it's not just the president says, I want this person to serve on the Supreme Court, but that the Congress holds hearings, right, and asks questions, right, and gets to ultimately say yes or no, right? That is the Congress's ability to have a check on the presidency. Okay, so the president appoints cabinet members, ambassadors, judges to the federal court, as within my last example, but the Senate has this advise and consent role, right? The ability to ultimately consent, say yes, or say no, right? That's a check on the presidency. Now, the president represents the national constituency, right? That means everybody, right, in the nation. And Congress represents districts or state constituencies, right? So whereas a president is supposed to be thinking about the whole country, and so are representatives from Congress and Senate as well, but they're also there on behalf of their local communities, right? They're there to represent their districts or the state constituencies. Continuing on with this question of checks and balances here. Okay, let's highlight checks and balances between the Congress and the judiciary. Okay, so where Congress makes the laws, the court is able to interpret them, or what the court does is to interpret them. Right, that's a check on it. It's not just right. Congress doesn't make laws and then go to court to see whether or not people are following the law. But that's for courts to do. Okay. Congress sets up lower federal courts and determines salaries. Congress decides jurisdiction for courts to hear cases. Congress passes legislation that limits courts' discretion to rule or impose sentences. And the Senate approves presidential nominations to the federal judiciary. Right? So we're highlighting the ways in which, even as each branch does something different, there's still a level of interconnectedness here amongst the branches. And we can see that visualized here. Right? I don't think this is the first time we've looked at checks and balances here, but you will see in this slide this kind of highlighting of the ways in which the executive branch has a check on the judicial branch, the way the judicial branch has a check on the executive branch, the way the legislative branch has a check on the executive branch, the way the executive branch has a check on the legislative branch, and let's keep going here. The way that the legislative branch has a check on the judicial branch, and the way the judicial branch can have a check on the legislative branch, right? So, for example, a check of the judicial branch on the legislative branch, right, because the legislative branch makes laws, well, a check from the judicial branch could say that a law is unconstitutional, right? That is a check on the legislative branch. They make the laws, right? The courts can say this law in and of itself is an unconstitutional law, and therefore we're going to throw it out, right? Is that not a check on the system? And we see this highlighted here, another way of these checks and balances. I will leave it up in the slides, of course, for you to check this out more deeply.